My groom threw food at my parents and pushed them at our wedding, calling them cheap people. When I tried to stop him, he pushed me too, and I fell. Everyone watched in silence, until a handsome stranger stood up and turned my nightmare into the best day of my life. What I'm about to share with you is the most traumatic and miraculous day of my life. If you believe in karma and justice, you need to hear this story. Hit subscribe now because what this mysterious man did next will leave you speechless. My name is Sarah, and 6 months ago, I thought my life was over. Today, I'm living a dream I never even knew I could have. But let me start from the beginning, because this story will show you how sometimes the worst moment of your life can become the doorway to your greatest blessing. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew everyone. My parents, Mom and Dad Martinez, owned a tiny bakery on Main Street. It wasn't much to look at: faded paint on the walls, old wooden tables that wobbled, and display cases that had seen better days. But what that little bakery lacked in glamour, it made up for in love. Every morning at 4 a.m., my parents would be there, kneading dough and filling the air with the smell of fresh bread and cinnamon rolls. Money was always tight in our house. I remember wearing the same dress to every school dance, and how my parents would quietly count bills at the kitchen table when they thought I wasn't looking. But they never complained. Instead, they taught me that dignity wasn't about what you owned. It was about how you treated people and how hard you were willing to work for what you believed in. After high school, I couldn't afford college, so I got a job as a waitress at Luna's coffee shop downtown. It wasn't glamorous work, but I was good at it. I remembered everyone's orders. I smiled even when customers were rude, and I always made sure the coffee was perfect. My parents were proud of me, and honestly, I was content. I had dreams of maybe opening my own little cafe someday, but I wasn't in any hurry. Life felt simple and safe. That all changed on a rainy Tuesday morning in March. I was working the breakfast shift when this man walked in. Tall, expensive suit, the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about money. He ordered a black coffee and a blueberry muffin, then sat in the corner booth with his laptop. Nothing unusual about that. We got business people all the time. But then he spilled his coffee. Not just a little splash. The entire cup went flying across his white shirt and expensive laptop. He exploded. I'm talking full-blown tantrum in the middle of a quiet coffee shop. He started yelling about how this was a disaster, how his presentation was ruined, how unprofessional we were for serving coffee in obviously defective cups. I rushed over with napkins and offered to help clean his laptop, but he just kept shouting. Other customers were staring, and I felt my face burning with embarrassment. Finally, he stormed out, leaving me to clean up the mess while everyone in the shop watched. I wanted to cry, but I just smiled and got back to work. That's what you do when you're a waitress. You swallow your pride and keep serving. I thought that was the end of it. But the next day, he came back. This time he was completely different. Apologetic, charming, almost shy. His name was Brandon Walsh, and he owned a consulting firm across town. He explained that he'd been under enormous stress with a major client presentation, and he felt terrible about how he'd acted. He bought coffee for everyone in the shop and left me $100 tip. I should have trusted my first instinct about him, but Brandon could be incredibly charming when he wanted to be. He started coming in every day, always sitting in my section, always making me laugh with stories about his business meetings and the ridiculous demands of his wealthy clients. He seemed genuinely interested in my dreams of opening a cafe, and he'd ask about my family's bakery with what seemed like real curiosity. After 2 weeks of these daily visits, he asked me out to dinner. Not just any dinner, he wanted to take me to Chez Laurent, the fanciest restaurant in the city. I'd never even walked past a place like that, let alone eaten there. I almost said no because I didn't have anything appropriate to wear, but Brandon insisted he wanted to show me how the other half lives. That dinner was like stepping into a different world. Crystal chandeliers, servers in bow ties, wine that cost more than I made in a week. Brandon ordered for both of us in French, and I felt completely out of place, but he was attentive and sweet, telling me I looked beautiful, even though I was wearing my only nice dress, a simple blue one I'd bought at a thrift store 3 years ago. Over the next few months, Brandon swept me off my feet. Expensive dinners, weekend trips to resorts I'd only seen in magazines, jewelry that made my coworkers gasp when they saw it. He had a way of making me feel like I was the most important person in the world when we were alone together. But there were warning signs I chose to ignore. The first time he met my parents, I could see the judgment in his eyes. Our little bakery suddenly felt shabby and embarrassing when viewed through his perspective. My parents, who had always seemed so dignified to me, appeared small and simple next to his polished confidence. Brandon was polite enough, but I caught the way he checked his expensive watch and seemed eager to leave. After that visit, the comments started. Little things at first, suggestions that maybe I should upgrade my wardrobe, hints that successful people needed to present themselves appropriately. He'd make jokes about small-town charm that didn't feel entirely kind. When I got defensive, he'd laugh and say he was just trying to help me fit into his world because he loved me so much. The worst part was how he slowly convinced me to be ashamed of my background. He'd take me to parties with his friends, wealthy, educated people who talked about their European vacations and their stock portfolios. I'd stand there in my thrift store dress, smiling and nodding, while feeling completely invisible. When someone asked what I did, Brandon would quickly change the subject or make a joke about me being his diamond in the rough. I started lying to people. Instead of saying I was a waitress, I'd mumble something vague about working in hospitality. Instead of proudly talking about my parents' bakery, I'd just say they were in food service. Each lie felt like a betrayal of everything my parents had taught me, but I convinced myself it was temporary. Once Brandon and I were married, once I belonged in his world, things would be different. The proposal came 8 months after we met. Brandon took me to the same expensive restaurant where we'd had our first date, got down on one knee right there in front of everyone, and presented me with a ring that probably cost more than my parents made in 2 years. The whole restaurant applauded, and I said yes because I thought this was what love looked like, grand gestures and expensive symbols. But planning the wedding became a nightmare. Brandon had very specific ideas about what our wedding should be, and all of them were expensive. He wanted the ceremony at the Grandview Country Club, the most exclusive venue in the city. He wanted a 7-course dinner, imported flowers, a live orchestra. The estimated cost was more money than my family had ever seen. When I gently suggested that maybe we could have something smaller, more intimate, Brandon's charming mask slipped a little. He reminded me that this wedding would be attended by important clients and business partners. He said that cutting corners would be embarrassing for both of us, and that he was sure my parents would want to give their daughter the wedding she deserved. My parents tried to hide their panic, but I could see it in their faces. They started working longer hours at the bakery, taking on catering jobs they'd never done before, selling family heirlooms they'd treasured for decades. When I begged them not to sacrifice so much, my mother just smiled and said that seeing me happy was worth any price. The guilt was eating me alive, but every time I tried to talk to Brandon about scaling back, he'd get frustrated. He'd remind me how much his family was contributing, how important this day was for our future, how disappointed he'd be if we had to settle for something ordinary. He had a way of making me feel selfish for even bringing it up. 3 weeks before the wedding, my parents presented me with their gift, a handmade recipe book filled with every recipe from our family bakery, going back 3 generations. My grandmother's cinnamon roll recipe, the secret to my father's famous sourdough, my mother's prize-winning apple pie. Each recipe was written in beautiful calligraphy, with little notes about family memories and traditions. It was the most precious thing they could have given me, but I knew Brandon wouldn't see it that way. His family had already given us a down payment on a house and a new car. What would they think of a homemade recipe book? I thanked my parents with tears in my eyes and quietly decided to leave the book at home on our wedding day. The morning of the wedding, I woke up with a knot in my stomach. I kept telling myself it was normal wedding nerves, but deep down, I think I already knew I was making a mistake. My parents arrived early to help me get ready, and seeing their proud, excited faces almost broke my heart. They looked so happy, so honored to be part of this day, even though it was costing them everything they had. Brandon's family treated the entire event like a business networking opportunity. His mother, Patricia Walsh, barely acknowledged my parents beyond a cold nod. His father, William, was too busy schmoozing with potential clients to bother with introductions. Brandon himself was stressed and irritable, snapping at the wedding coordinator and complaining about everything from the flower arrangements to the temperature in the room. But there was one guest who stood out from the crowd, a man sitting alone near the back of the ceremony space. He was probably in his early 40s, impeccably dressed, but not flashy about it. Dark hair, kind eyes, and something about him commanded respect without demanding attention. I had no idea who he was or which side had invited him, but something about his presence felt calming in the chaos of the day. The ceremony itself was a blur of expensive flowers and nervous smiles. Brandon's vows sounded rehearsed and hollow, full of generic promises about love and devotion that could have been copied from a wedding website. When it was my turn to speak, I looked out at the crowd and saw my parents in the front row, beaming with pride despite everything they'd sacrificed to be there. That's when I found my voice and spoke from my heart about real love, about partnership, about building a life with someone who truly saw and valued you. I noticed the mysterious man in the back nodding slightly as I spoke, and for just a moment his approval seemed more important than all the rest. The reception was where everything fell apart. Brandon's family had insisted on giving the first toasts, and they used the opportunity to talk about business connections, social status, and the bright future that came with proper breeding and education. My parents sat quietly through it all, their discomfort obvious to anyone who cared to look. Then came the gift presentation. Brandon's parents had already made a big show of announcing their expensive gifts, the house down payment, the car, a trust fund for our future children. When it was time for my parents to present their gift, I wanted to disappear into the floor. My father stood up nervously and explained that they had brought something from the heart, the family recipe book they'd spent months creating. He talked about how food had always been the center of our family, how recipes were passed down like treasures, how they wanted to share that tradition with Brandon and me as we started our own family. I watched Brandon's face change as my father spoke. His expression went from polite interest to barely concealed disgust. When my mother handed him the beautifully bound book, he held it like it might contaminate him. He flipped through a few pages, his lip curling with each turn. Recipes? His voice was loud enough for nearby tables to hear. You're giving us recipes? My father's smile faltered. They're family recipes, going back generations. We thought. You thought wrong. Brandon's voice was getting louder, and conversations at nearby tables were stopping. Do you have any idea what this wedding cost? Do you know what my family has invested in this day? And you bring us a cookbook? I reached for his arm, trying to calm him down. Brandon, please. It's a beautiful gift. My grandmother's recipes are... He shook me off. Don't defend this, Sarah. This is exactly the kind of small thinking that's been holding you back. He stood up, still holding the recipe book. My parents gave us a house. A CAR, real gifts that show real investment in our future. And what do we get from your side? Handwritten notes about how to make bread? The entire reception had gone quiet now. 200 people watching in horrified fascination as my new husband publicly humiliated my parents. My mother's face had gone pale, but she was trying to smile, trying to defuse the situation with grace. We just wanted to share something meaningful, she said softly. Something with history and love? Love doesn't pay bills, Brandon interrupted. Love doesn't buy houses or cars or build businesses. He held up the recipe book. This is exactly why Sarah needed to marry up, so she could leave this small-minded, small-town thinking behind. That's when he threw the book down. It hit the floor with a slap that echoed through the silent room, and pages scattered like wounded birds. My grandmother's careful handwriting, my mother's love-filled notes, 3 generations of family history trampled under expensive shoes. My father moved to pick up the pages, and that's when Brandon lost what little control he had left. He grabbed my father by the arm and shoved him away from the scattered papers. Don't, Brandon snarled. Don't embarrass us any more than you already have. You want to know the truth? I never wanted you people at this wedding. Sarah deserves better than this bargain basement family, and so do I." My mother rushed to help my father, who had stumbled when Brandon pushed him. She was trying to gather the scattered recipe pages while keeping her dignity intact, but I could see tears starting to form in her eyes. "Get out," Brandon continued, his voice rising to a shout. "Just take your cheap gifts and your small dreams and get out of here. This is a classy event for successful people, not a charity dinner for—" That's when he grabbed the plate of wedding cake from the table and threw it right at my mother. The beautiful white frosting splattered across her best dress, the only formal dress she owned, the one she'd spent weeks picking out for her daughter's wedding day. "You cheap people need to learn your place." Brandon was screaming now, completely out of control. "This is my wedding, my family's event, and I won't have it ruined by your pathetic—" I couldn't stay silent anymore. I jumped up from my chair and got between Brandon and my parents. "Stop it! Stop it right now! These are my parents, and you can't—" The push came so suddenly I didn't see it coming. Brandon's hand connected with my shoulder and sent me stumbling backward in my heavy wedding dress. The elaborate gown tangled around my legs, and I went down hard, the sound of tearing fabric mixing with my cry of shock and pain. I lay there on the floor in my ruined wedding dress, frosting in my hair, looking up at a room full of people who had just watched my husband push me down and humiliate my family, and every single one of them was just staring. Not one person moved to help me, not one voice spoke up in protest. They just watched, like this was entertainment instead of a human being's worst nightmare. My parents rushed to my side, my father helping me sit up while my mother tried to clean the cake frosting from my dress. They were both crying now, not just from their own humiliation, but from seeing their daughter treated this way on what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. Brandon stood over us, still angry, still self-righteous. "Look what you made me do," he said, as if somehow this was our fault. "If you people knew how to behave appropriately, none of this would have happened." The silence in that room was deafening, 200 people, and not one of them willing to stand up for what was right. I felt smaller and more alone than I ever had in my entire life. That's when I heard the chair push back. The sound cut through the silence like a knife, and every head turned toward the back of the room. The mysterious man I'd noticed during the ceremony was standing up, his movements deliberate and controlled. He wasn't rushing, wasn't shouting, but somehow his quiet actions commanded more attention than all of Brandon's screaming. He walked toward us with the kind of confidence that doesn't need to announce itself. His footsteps were the only sound in that massive room as he made his way past table after table of frozen faces. When he reached our area, he knelt down beside me with gentle dignity and offered me his hand. "Are you hurt?" His voice was deep, calm, concerned. Not the voice of someone trying to be a hero, but of a human being who genuinely cared about another person's well-being. I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak, and let him help me to my feet. He was strong but gentle, making sure I was steady before he let go of my hand. Then he turned to my parents, helping them up with the same careful respect. "Mr. and Mrs. Martinez," he said, and I was shocked that he knew their names. "Are you both all right?" Only then did he turn to face Brandon, and I saw something in his eyes that made my husband take a step backward. It wasn't anger exactly, but something much more dangerous, complete and utter disapproval from someone who clearly wasn't afraid of anything. "And you are?" Brandon tried to sound authoritative, but his voice cracked slightly. "I'm Daniel Harrison," the man replied evenly, "and I think you and I need to have a conversation." I'd never heard the name Daniel Harrison before, but I watched Brandon's face go white as recognition dawned. All around the room I could see other guests whispering, heads turning, people pulling out their phones to Google something. "Mr. Harrison," Brandon stammered, his aggressive posture collapsing into nervous deference. I didn't know you were— I wasn't expecting— No, I don't imagine you were." Daniel Harrison's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath the politeness. "I came here today as a guest, planning to celebrate what I hoped would be a joyful occasion. Instead, I've watched a grown man assault his new bride and humiliate her parents in front of 200 people. He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. But before we address your behavior, I think there are some things this room should know about the Martinez family. He turned to address the entire reception, his voice carrying easily without shouting. 10 years ago, I was nobody, a failed entrepreneur with a rejected business plan, sleeping in my car, eating one meal a day when I was lucky. I had meetings all over this city, trying to find someone, anyone, willing to take a chance on a small tech startup that nobody believed in. The room was completely silent now, hanging on every word. One morning, I walked into Martinez Family Bakery with my last $5, planning to buy a cup of coffee, and spend the day working on my laptop using their Wi-Fi. I must have looked as desperate as I felt, because Mrs. Martinez took one look at me and brought me a full breakfast without me ordering it. When I tried to explain that I could only afford coffee, she told me that young people needed proper food to do their best thinking. I looked at my mother, tears streaming down my face. That was exactly something she would do. I spent 3 months working at a corner table in that bakery, Daniel continued. Every day Mrs. Martinez made sure I ate. Every day Mr. Martinez would ask about my business plan, offering encouragement and practical advice. They never made me feel like a charity case. They treated me like family. He turned back to my parents, his expression softening. When my company finally took off, when I signed my first major contract, the first thing I did was go back to that little bakery to thank them, but they wouldn't let me pay them back. They said the joy of seeing someone succeed was payment enough. The crowd was murmuring now, pieces clicking into place. Daniel Harrison. I was starting to remember seeing that name in business magazines, on financial news programs. He wasn't just wealthy, he was one of the most successful tech entrepreneurs in the country. What they didn't know, Daniel continued, was that I'd been watching their business ever since. Watching them work 18-hour days, watching them put their daughter through school, watching them treat every customer like a member of their own family. And I've been waiting for the right opportunity to repay their kindness. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an official-looking envelope. 6 months ago, I had my lawyers draw up partnership papers. I've been planning to offer Mr. and Mrs. Martinez the opportunity to expand their bakery into a chain of family restaurants. Not because I feel sorry for them, but because they represent exactly the kind of values and work ethic that builds lasting success. My parents looked stunned, holding each other's hands as this incredible man continued speaking. The initial investment I'm prepared to make is $2 million. Daniel announced, and gasps echoed through the room. But that's just the beginning. Based on my analysis of their business model and the loyalty of their customer base, I believe we can build something truly special together. He turned back to Brandon, and his voice grew cold again. Which brings us back to you, Mr. Walsh. You see, I also happen to know quite a bit about Walsh Consulting. In fact, your company has been trying to get a contract with Harrison Industries for over a year. Brandon's face had gone from white to green. Mr. Harrison, please, let me explain. There's nothing to explain. Daniel cut him off. I've seen exactly who you are. I've watched you assault your wife and throw food at people who have shown more grace and dignity in the last 10 minutes than you've shown in your entire life. And I can tell you right now that Harrison Industries will never, under any circumstances, do business with a man who treats people this way. He looked around the room at all the guests who had sat in silence while I was being humiliated. I'm curious about the rest of you. You all sat here and watched a woman get pushed down by her husband on her wedding day. You watched her parents get humiliated and assaulted, and not one of you said a word. Is this really the kind of people you want to be? The shame in that room was palpable. People were looking at their hands, at the floor, anywhere but at Daniel Harrison's disappointed face. He turned back to me, his expression gentle again. Sarah, I have a proposition for you. Harrison Industries is expanding our community outreach program, and we need someone to head up our new initiative connecting with family-owned businesses across the region. The position comes with a 6-figure salary, full benefits, and the opportunity to help other families build the kind of success your parents deserve. I couldn't speak. Couldn't think. This whole day had been such an emotional roller coaster that I felt like I was living in a dream. "You don't have to answer now," Daniel said kindly. "Take all the time you need. But I want you to know that there are people in this world who will value you for exactly who you are, not ask you to apologize for where you come from." That's when I found my voice. Standing there in my torn wedding dress, with cake frosting still in my hair, I looked at Brandon, really looked at him, and saw him clearly for the first time. He wasn't charming or sophisticated. He was just a small, insecure man who thought money could buy him the right to treat people badly. "I have my answer," I said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. I reached behind my neck and unclasped the expensive necklace Brandon had given me for our engagement. I placed it on the table, followed by the wedding ring that had cost more than my parents' annual income. "I'm sorry, everyone," I announced to the crowd, "but there's not going to be a marriage today. I can't marry someone who would treat my family or anyone the way Brandon has treated them." The gasps and murmurs from the crowd were immediate, but I didn't care. I walked over to my parents, who wrapped me in the kind of hug that reminded me exactly where I belonged. "I'm sorry, Mom and Dad," I whispered. "I'm so sorry I let this happen. I'm sorry I was ashamed of you even for a second. You're the most amazing people I know, and I should have been proud to introduce you to the world." "We love you no matter what, Mija," my father whispered back. "We just want you to be happy." Daniel Harrison stepped forward one more time. "If you're ready to leave, I'd be honored to drive you and your parents home. I think you've all had enough excitement for one day." Brandon tried one last desperate attempt to fix the situation. "Sarah, please. You're making a huge mistake. Think about what you're giving up. Think about our future." I looked at him with clear eyes. "I am thinking about my future, and it doesn't include someone who thinks love means being ashamed of where you come from." As we walked toward the exit, Daniel Harrison walking beside us like a protective guardian, I heard the chaos erupting behind us. Brandon's parents frantically trying to salvage their social standing, guests whispering about what they'd just witnessed, wedding vendors wondering if they'd get paid. But I didn't look back. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. 6 months later, I'm writing this story from my new office at Harrison Industries. The community outreach program has been the most rewarding work of my life, helping connect small family businesses with the resources they need to grow and thrive. My parents' bakery is now the flagship location of Martinez Family Restaurants, with 3 locations and plans for 5 more. And Daniel? He's become so much more than a boss or a business partner. He's become my closest friend, my biggest supporter, and yes, though we're taking things slow, I think he might be the love of my life. The real kind of love, the kind that celebrates who you are instead of asking you to change. Brandon's consulting firm went under within 2 months. Turns out that when word spread about how he'd behaved at our wedding, most of his clients decided they didn't want to be associated with that kind of person. He tried to reach out to me several times, apologizing and begging for another chance, but I learned something important that day. When someone shows you who they really are, believe them. The best part of all this is watching my parents thrive. They're still the same loving, generous people they always were, but now they have the resources to help even more people. They've hired 12 employees and started a program to provide free meals to struggling families. Every day I see them treating their success the same way they treated their struggles, with grace, humility, and an open heart. That terrible wedding day taught me that real love doesn't ask you to be smaller. It doesn't ask you to be ashamed of your family or apologize for your background. Real love sees everything you are, including where you come from, and says, "Perfect, I love all of it." I almost married the wrong man because I thought I had to earn love by becoming someone else. But the right man loved me because of who I already was, including the family that raised me and the values that shaped me. Sometimes the worst day of your life is actually the first day of your real life. Sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you wanted to find everything you actually need. And sometimes when you're at your lowest point, a stranger will stand up and remind you that you deserve better than you ever imagined possible. That story proves that karma is real and character matters more than wealth. My parents never sought revenge. They just lived with dignity and kindness, and the universe rewarded them. If this story inspired you to treat everyone with respect regardless of their background, smash that like button and share this video. Remember, you are enough just as you are, and real love will never ask you to be ashamed of where you come from. What would you have done in my situation? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories of justice and second chances.